Hello again and welcome back to our course on PSE 15. In this section we're going to start to look in some detail at editing in quick mode, and in particular we're going to look at using quick mode adjustments, which were introduced primarily to fix problems or perceived problems in images, but which are often used for effect as well. I've got the adjustments panel open on the right there, and we're going to look at those adjustments in just a moment. A couple of things I should point out. One of them is when we're applying these adjustments at the moment, we'll be applying them to whole images. As you'll see, with just about any adjustment that you can make in PSE, you can apply it to just part of an image if you need to. And also in this section, I'm using sample images of my own. In some cases, they were deliberately taken to look bad, and some of them just turned out that way. Once you've started working through this section, or perhaps when you've completed it, it would be a really good idea to take some of your own images and try to apply these adjustments to your own images. I should also point out that while I'm working on this in quick mode, my view option is before and after horizontal. This does mean that the images you're looking at are a little bit smaller than they absolutely need to be, but it does have the advantage that you can see more clearly what the effect of each adjustment is. Let me open the first image. What I have here is a picture of a church. And as you can see, although the sky is nice and bright, the church itself is in deep shadow. And so it's very difficult to make out any detail on the church at all. There are various ways that I could go about improving this. So for instance, I might look at the lighting or the colour or the balance. One option that's always available, the first option on the adjustment panel there, is Smart Fix. And let's do a Smart Fix on this image. Bear in mind that I've got the before on the left and the after on the right. If I click on the drop down next to Smart Fix, you'll see a little gallery, and these are really presets. And the one with the little symbol on it, which is a reset symbol, is our starting point. That's where we are now. If I wanted to try one of the other presets, and there are 9 presets in total, if I hover over it, and if you look at the picture on the right, the after picture, you can see the effect of each preset. And generally speaking, the farther I get away from the starting point, the more extreme the effect is, and I may well get to the point where I think the effect is too strong. Notice that as I'm doing that, the slider above represents the level of the particular effect that I'm applying, in this case the particular Smart Fix. So that's 100, that's the most extreme that it's prepared to do. The middle one there is 50, the one on the right of 50 is 62, the one below 50 is 87, and so on. So you can hover over these with this live preview and decide which of those you prefer. Alternatively, there is an auto button, and if I click on auto, then PSE will choose the Smart Fix that it thinks is appropriate. So let's try auto. And that's what it thinks is about right for this image. Now that's certainly an improvement on what's there already, but let me just go back to these presets again and have another look at the presets. I think I actually prefer that one to the auto setting, so let me click on that one. Yes, I think I prefer that. If at any time I want to go back to the starting point, that's what the reset does. Now a couple of other things to be aware of. One of them is that each of these presets corresponds to a value on the slider. You can use the slider yourself to achieve intermediate values. So you could just use it as a slider, and similarly you can click in the little control to the right of the slider and type in a value in the range 0 to 100 yourself. But whichever way you plan to do it, and I'm still happy with that 50% setting, click on that. That adjustment has been applied, and also of course don't forget you've always got the undo option up here. Or indeed I have an undo button on the bar at the bottom left. So in this particular case I'm really back to where I started from. And just before I move on, for those of you who may be interested in what and where this church is, you may have heard of the children's nursery rhyme about Widdicombe Fair. Widdicombe is a village in England, and that's the church in Widdicombe. I'm now going to move on to look at a couple of the other adjustment options in quick mode. But before I do, let me just remind you of a couple of things. One of them is, if some of the terminology that I use from now on involves expressions that you've not heard before, don't forget the Photoshop Elements Visual Dictionary that I pointed out to you before. So if you want to check exactly what we mean by exposure, for example, click on exposure there. It takes you through to a basic description of what exposure is, but then links through to many other sources of information about topics related to exposure. From here we can also, for instance, go to a section on highlight and shadow. And many of these terms are terms that I'm going to be using from now on. I'm going to explain them as I go along as far as possible, but very often it's useful to have additional sources of information, particularly if you've not come across these things before. And also don't forget the Photoshop Elements PDF, because there's a lot of information in there about quick mode, including a description of each of the adjustment tools. And if you follow up on any of these terms within the PDF itself, you'll find quite a bit more information about how each of these adjustments works. I want to look again at Smart Fix on the church and just point out something that you may or may not have noticed already. If I hover over these presets, let me go for the middle one there, for example. Look at how much it lightens up the church itself, but look at the effect on the sky. Now, although it lightens up the church quite a bit, the effect on the sky is much less. And in fact, the Smart Fix really is quite smart, because it's lightening up the darker areas of the image and having much less of an effect on the lighter areas. And as you'll see, particularly later on in the course, some of the adjustments that you make in PSE need to be targeted at particular problem areas. I'm going to move now on to exposure. And we're going to look at the exposure adjustment, but note that this adjustment always applies in quick mode to the whole image. So there's no intelligence built in to apply more in one place than another. Note also that with exposure, the default setting is the 0 setting in the middle, and that I can either go for negative adjustment, which means making the whole image darker, or a positive adjustment, which means making the whole image lighter. So again, as you'll see later on, there are various tools and techniques in PSE that let you target particular areas of an image or particular problems in an image with the adjustments and fixes that you apply. But in quick mode, you have effectively a sort of subset of these options. You have some things available and not others. And for many people, they don't really have the time or the inclination to learn these much more sophisticated tools associated particularly with expert editing. Quick mode does the job. You have to be careful how you use it. So for instance, you need to realize that exposure in quick mode applies to the whole image. But it gives you a quick way of fixing problems. And Smart Fix can quite often do the job for you. And as you've seen already, it's not exactly a lot of work to apply Smart Fix to an image. The next adjustment I'd like to look at is lighting, and this will give you a much more of a clue as to the differences between, say, Smart Fix and exposure. Because if I go to lighting, I've actually got three options. I've got shadows, midtones and highlights. And if you take an image like this one of Widdicombe Church, you have highlight areas of the image that you can adjust. You have the mid-tone areas of the image that you can adjust, and you have the shadows that you can adjust. Let's start with shadows. You can certainly see there are a lot of shadows in this image. Note that the default setting, the 0 setting, is the top left. If I go, say, for the middle setting, note which parts of the image are affected by that as I preview it. It's really just the shadow areas. If you look at the sky barely changes, whereas the parts of the image that are in shadow are affected much more by this adjustment, even than they were in Smart Fix. And if I go to an even more extreme adjustment, you can see, if you like, that I've overexposed the church, and yet there is still barely any effect on the sky at all. So with this lighting setting, you can adjust just particular aspects of the image. So if I selected midtones, did the same thing, the default here is in the middle. I can reduce the light in the midtones, I can increase the light, and in this case when I adjust the midtones I'll probably make the picture significantly worse actually, but as usual it's a really good idea to experiment with these. Let's just take a look at highlights. Zero setting is the top left. Now I'm adjusting the highlights. See how much the sky is changing? Whereas on this occasion it's the areas in shadow that are adjusted much less. There are a couple of additional options there, auto levels and auto contrast. I'm going to talk about levels and contrast later in the course. In the meantime, by all means experiment with those, and don't forget the sources of information that will explain to you what they do. Before we move on to a quick look at the remaining adjustments, one important point is that you're not restricted to applying one adjustment to an image. You can have any combination of these that you like. And in fact, right at the top of the adjustments panel, there is one of those reset buttons that resets all of the adjustments you've made in one go. So effectively it resets the image to its very starting point. When it comes to adjusting color, once again you have three settings: saturation, hue and vibrance. You may or may not be familiar with those terms. Let me give you a very brief description, but bear in mind you have sources of information that can explain the terms more fully. Adjusting the saturation changes how vivid or muted a colour is. If I take the saturation setting here and click top left away from the default setting in the centre, I have effectively a black and white image because I've basically muted colour altogether. Whereas if I go to the other extreme, I've made all of the colours much more vivid. Hue, on the other hand, shifts the colour. So for instance, I can move it in that direction or towards a more green colour. You get some very extreme and usually very artificial effects here, but sometimes an effect like that is the effect that you want to achieve. With vibrance, what we're doing is to cause the lower saturated colours to become more vivid, but stopping the colours that are already vivid from going too far. So if you look at the vibrance setting here, I'm going to take the less vibrant colours and make them a bit more vibrant, but without making the others too extreme. Again, the best thing here is for you to experiment with these, and of course there's an auto setting as well. The next setting is balance. We have two options here, temperature and tint. Normally it's best to set the temperature setting first. Basically temperature lets you slide from cooler blue colours to warmer red colours. So if I take an extreme blue and extreme red, obviously you're going to operate within a range between those two. And having set the colour temperature, you can set the colour tint. And tint basically lets you adjust the colour on a range from green to magenta. And adjusting balance is used both to fix problems and for effect. The last adjustment that I want to quickly demonstrate now is sharpening. This particular image doesn't really suffer too much from blurred edges, but in those trees there's been a certain amount of movement and the definition on the trees is not as sharp as it would be on a still day. What I'm going to do is to quickly demonstrate sharpening, and that will also demonstrate some of the potential pitfalls of sharpening as well. It works very well, but it doesn't work in every situation. First of all, let me zoom right into a part of one of the trees. Now you can see that probably because of movement in the air, the tree is a little bit blurry. And if I want to sharpen it, I can use this sharpening scale or one of the presets. Let me use just the first preset, so this is quite a low level of sharpening. You can see the effect, and part of the effect is it certainly makes the edge look sharper, but it also tends to pixelate the image a little and quite often causes a sort of halo effect around the edge. You can see it around the trees, but you can also see it slightly along the side of the church tower, how you get that sort of halo effect. Now we're looking at it there zoomed right in. Let's zoom out again and see what effect this has had. at the original zoom level of 17%, you may just about be able to make out that the tree does actually look sharper. Let me go in just a little way, and you'll see that the tree actually is sharper. Probably not too sharp, and there's definitely an improvement. But if I went for a much greater setting like that, the appearance of the whole thing is very much different. The tree looks very sharp now, but look at the edge of the tower as well. So sharpening does work, but you need to apply it with caution, and it doesn't always work. So that's it on quick mode adjustments. I'll see you in the next section.